Hello, it's Scott Manley here with part 26 of Kerbal's Spaceships Are Serious Business. Now, while I am building a big rocket to go to the moon again, well, this is the reason why we have been stuck for the last couple of weeks without a game. You can see in the debug console, invalid parameter, oh my goodness, things are going wrong, there is much wailing and gnashing of teeth, cats and dogs sleep together and mass hysteria reigns. Basically, there was a bug and I needed to fix it. Anyway, much fixing and save file editing was done, and I eventually regained control of my Venus space probe. This is the first one, the one that does not have enough delta V to get into orbit. So, I decided, since I did have a second one which can get into orbit, that I would, instead of going over the polar approach, I would swing it past Venus and let it kind of fly off into space, and maybe I could get further gravity assists. I wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do with it. I didn't want it kicked out of the plane. So, we are, of course, a long way from Earth at this point. This means we need to use the flight computer because of the delay, the signal delay that we get. So I use the in-flight computer to point at the maneuver node. I then tell it to execute the planned maneuver. And then I just watch time run forwards. This is going to be a 43 meter per second burn. And you can also see it says things like cancelling and command. I was probably clicking some button or other. And yeah, you can see that it's a 1 minute 21 second delay from this location. But the maneuver computer kicks in, the flight computer does the maneuver. This is not mechanical jet, but this is something which comes with remote tech. It's designed to perform very simple maneuvers on command. Anyway, it's not quite as precise as I would like. So after obviously letting these commands run through the system, you see that it has 0.2 meters per second of delta V left over, and that means that my approach to the surface of Venus isn't quite as close as I would like. So I decide to make a further correction a little closer to Venus, where the accuracy is less important. And so what I'm doing is, the closer I am to Venus, the less accurate the burn needs to be. And this is what NASA does all the time. They set up a bunch of places along the orbit, along their trajectory, where they want to make burns, and then they'll decide. Sometimes they don't need to, sometimes they do. So yeah, I set up another maneuver to bring my orbit down really, really close, just to skim the clouds of Venus. And obviously you don't want to get too close, because Venus is of course the place where you will be simultaneously crushed, suffocated, broiled and corroded at the same time. Anyway, the timer expires and the maneuver begins. But unfortunately for me, I forgot to set it up in maneuver following orientation prior to this. So what happens is it basically moves the maneuver node around, and the spacecraft starts chasing after the maneuver node, which is a problem. In fact, it's unable to catch the maneuver node, so I eventually, or very quickly, realized that this thing is just going to go around in circles, not really making any significant changes to its orbit. It had several hundred meters per second of delta V, and it's going to burn it all off, trying to get onto that maneuver node there. You see, in fact, that the delta V is increasing. It's getting higher because this thing can't actually track what it's supposed to. And for bonus hilarity points, as soon as I saw this was wrong, I decided to shut down the engine. But, of course, being 2.5 minutes from Earth, the signal will take 2.5 minutes to get there, and I only had about 1.5 minutes worth of fuel. So by the time the shutdown signal comes, that spacecraft will be long out of fuel. At least I'm a nice guy that didn't actually make you watch the whole thing. Instead, you get to hear what sounds like a machine gun as the automated flight computer keeps trying to fire that engine and is unable to due to the lack of fuel. Anyway, the computer can't do any more to ruin this mission, so I see just how close I'm coming. 924 kilometers. I have no idea if that is going to be close enough to get some proper science from this flypast, but we are committed. We cannot change this, and we are effectively stranded, but we are not dead yet, as indeed the spacecraft flies into the sphere of influence of Venus. It sends out a signal saying, "I'm not dead yet!" So we collect all this magnificent science data and beam it back home to the elated scientists who are quite happy to at least have something to show and therefore keep their jobs. Now, of course, I wouldn't have fired them. After all, this is a more Soviet-style space program. We would have sent them to Siberia or, executed them. No, I'm just kidding. They would have just been the next volunteers for experiments. Anyway, having my first encounter with Venus be a failed flyby is actually slightly better than the real-world version. So Venera 1 was the first successful flyby of another planet. It was a Soviet spacecraft, and it was super innovative. I think it was actually the first spacecraft to use a parabolic antenna, and I haven't really got that here. I guess I have a tiny little parabola on there. Venera 1 was the first spacecraft to perform mid-course course corrections, and it flew within 100,000 kilometers of Venus, but unfortunately they lost contact with it, probably due to, or it's believed because of damage to its sun sensor that would be used to orient it. They didn't get as close as I did, so I'm quite happy to be getting this close to the planet. And of course, still, while we're in high space, we can get gravitational readings, biome-specific gravity readings. And yeah, we're just kind of moving through space here, waiting for an encounter. Obviously, everyone's at home, holding their breath, or not at home. They're not. If they were at home when they should have been in the mission control, they should have been fired. Oh no, wait, we don't fire people. No, if you're not in mission control being super excited about a spacecraft going to Venus, then you will be the first person to visit Venus. Anyway, yeah, their first spacecraft to actually return scientific data from Venus was Mariner 2. Mariner 1, incidentally, it exploded on launch, but of course, back in those days, they would build 2 copies of the spacecraft because, hey, 50-50 chance. It's nice if you can get 2 of them into space, like Voyager 1 and 2. But yeah, Mariner 2 flew past Venus and provided all sorts of details. I think it flew within about 30,000 kilometers. And again, I'm doing way better than that. We drop within 2,000 kilometers and finally we get near Venus science. We get all the sciences from all the instruments. We get the thermometer, the seismometer, micrometeor detector. We get the gravity detector. We get the pressure barometer, which is of course 0 because we're in space, but it's good science nevertheless. And of course, radiation and spacecraft telemetry and everything else. It is truly a glorious moment for our space program. But without any fuel to change its course, it is doomed to fly past the planet, get but a small glimpse of what could be, and then return ultimately to the depths of space, where it is unlikely to ever come close to any other planet ever again for any long amount of time. Also, at some point, it would be really nice if I could actually get the visualization or the visuals enhancement running on this with clouds and everything. That is something I would like to have. But yeah, in real life, obviously the Soviets and the Americans both sent plenty of spacecraft to Venus because it is the easiest target to get to. But having been beaten there, the Soviets were the ones that decided, let's land in the most hellish place in the inner solar system. Well, the most hellish place other than the sun, but you're not going to be landing on the sun, are you? Unless you go at night. I'm pretty sure the other space agencies have decided to cede that particular record to North Korea, right? But yeah, Venera 3 was supposed to land on Venus. Unfortunately, they lost contact with it, so it may have landed on Venus, but it certainly never returned any data. Venera 4, it re-entered and it started returning data and it floated down on a parachute until it was eventually destroyed. The first actual landing where they returned data from the surface was Venera 7, and it lasted a whole 23 minutes. And as Venus fades into the distance, we turn our sights to look at the science meter which is deployed in mission control that shows us all the science we've got. And we have a veritable bounty of science, 620 sciences, which we spend on specialized construction, which should actually help with improving our tanks, and it should help also letting us have bigger tanks and things like that. Looking down at the bottom, we do find a bunch of things like electronics that will bring us up to 1970s art technology or precision engineering, which will give us the gas chromatograph spectrometer. Something that will basically give us more science from these landings. Now, to get the electronics up to 1970 status would take 300 science. I think I decided not to go anywhere with this at this point. And instead, while my engineers continue to beaver away on the next big rocket, we go back out to the Venus Device 2, which has also had a lot of save file editing going on to stop it completely ruining my game. You notice I have the debug console up just to make sure that it works, and this time I breathe a sigh of relief and punch the air in victory as I realize that I am in fact going to be able to put this thing into orbit. Hallelujah! Praise the goddess of love that is Venus. Now, as before, I perform many meticulous manipulations of the maneuver node to bring my spacecraft onto a very, very, very close flyby, carefully tweaking those maneuver node values, trying to skim past planet Venus close enough that we will maximize the Oberth effect and thereby let myself get captured. More importantly, I set it up so that I will pass over the poles and therefore when I go into orbit, I should be able to cover every single biome eventually. That is a 17.4 meter per second burn, and this time I am very careful to make sure I set my node pointing ahead of time. As it happens, hours ahead of time, because we never want to be caught by surprise by the wrong pointing happening at the last minute. 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, this is fast obviously, and fire that engine! Fire that engine to bring this thing onto its final rendezvous, whatever, approach vector. The engine shuts down with 2,213 meters per second of delta V left and an altitude of 94 kilometers. No, we're gonna burn up in the atmosphere if we do that. We're going to have to fix that. Well, strictly speaking, we don't actually know if we're gonna burn up, but it was felt to be pretty much a wise move not to skim past the atmosphere when we have plenty of delta V. The plan is we're going to go into orbit using a powered engine burn, and then after spending a fair amount of time, I might lower my periaps, just dip a toe into the upper atmosphere of Venus, and then I'll kind of spread my arms and use the drag to bring myself down carefully, very carefully, hopefully into a closer, tighter orbit where more science can be gained. Anyway, that burn was slightly higher than expected, but it is fine. So now we set up our capture maneuver here. We're going to put ourselves into a highly eccentric orbit because that will require the least amount of fuel. You see that we're only using 1,500 meters per second. That should leave us with about 700 meters per second to perform further manipulation of the orbit when the time comes. But that time is still days away. You can see Venus there sitting above the sun because we're coming in from below the ecliptic. We're going to fly up underneath it over its poles and zip past, fire our engine to slow ourselves down, and then we will absorb all the science it has to offer. We will practically bathe in the science that it is offering us. It will be like having a bath with the goddess of love herself. But in fact, it'll be more like having a number going up and making me feel better about my progress in this game. Come to think of it, actually, having a bath with Venus seems like a really bad idea given the amount of sulfuric and phosphoric acid involved in the Venusian atmosphere. Actually, having a bath with Venus sounds like a really bad idea given the amount of acids and stuff in the atmosphere of Venus. I mean, this is it, if you're going to try and land a space probe on Venus, it's really easy to get it to slow down and land. The hard part is that the atmospheric pressure is like being 800 meters underwater. The temperatures are hot enough to melt lead, there's acid there, and the winds are pretty bad as well. But there are people still planning to make landers for Venus. The last time a lander went to Venus was the Vega spacecraft. Those weren't really landers, they were balloons that floated around in the upper atmosphere. But both NASA and Roscosmos have plans for Venus landers, which should last a whole lot longer. Anyway, the Venus Device 2 will spend a great deal of time in the loving embrace of Venus's gravity. It is performing its deceleration maneuver as the flight computer has told it to, I guess. It's gonna take a while, actually. This is one of the longer burns I've had to make, because 1500 meters per second on that tiny little engine is no simple thing. But at least you can rely on anything. I mean, obviously in real life the Venus lander missions and everything else was filled with all sorts of interesting failures. I said that Venera 7 was the first spacecraft to successfully land and return data from the surface. Actually, it's not quite as simple as that. What happened was during descent into the atmosphere, its parachute failed and it hit the surface going way faster than it should. And back in mission control, or whatever they call it in Russia, they thought it was a failure. But it wasn't until afterwards that they examined the tapes and they found out there was a signal there and it had been returning data. It's just that the antenna wasn't pointed correctly at Earth. It hit the ground and kind of bounced around, but there was enough signal coming out that somebody got data back from it. Venera 14, the last of the Venera missions to land on Venus, it landed and had a whole bunch of experiments to examine the surface, but the camera lens cap popped off and landed exactly where those instruments were supposed to go to test the surface, so they ended up testing the properties of the lens cap. And indeed, Venera 11 and 12, the lens caps didn't come off. Anyway, having filled enough time, we are just about finished our burn, and Venus Device 2 has successfully entered orbit around the planet Venus. It is a long, eccentric orbit. Now we're still going to fly past the planet at this point, collect whatever science we can, and then fade off into the distance. And admire Venus from a great distance. Look at that. Looks beautiful there, hanging out in space. But you know what? I think that orbit is too long and too eccentric. I do want it to be a little more frequent so I can have better chance of actually collecting data close to the surface, finding a biome where my spacecraft is within a couple of thousand kilometers. So I tweak my orbit just a bit, looking around to see if there's a way that I can get it over the poles. But I don't want to burn out all of my fuel. I want to leave a bit of fuel behind because I want to actually perform an aerobraking maneuver and at least see how long I can do that. So I decide to burn, about 560 meters per second, I guess, just here, bringing my orbital period down, leaving my spacecraft a little closer to the surface, and just leaving a couple of hundred meters, or not even that, 100 meters per second in reserve just to keep tweaking it during aerobraking maneuvers. And that will be a long, slow process. And I'm not even going to begin aerobraking until I've collected data from as many biomes as possible. And of course, since the orbit doesn't rotate, you're relying on the planet's rotation to bring the different biomes into view to the instruments. And with Venus has like the slowest rotation of any planet in the solar system. And not only that, incidentally, Venus actually rotates the opposite direction to basically every other planet in the solar system. Which is kind of interesting when you consider that the winds actually rotate around the planet way faster than that. They're driven by the sun, whereas the planet itself is just kind of sitting there and doing nothing. But yeah, we got ourselves into orbit, and we are, of course, collecting as much science as we can, and we will spend a great deal of time here. I will go back to it in future. I will orbit around it, rather like this, collecting science whenever it becomes available. But while that happens, our Hydro Moon Challenger Mark II has been readied for launch. This is bigger and faster and more powerful. The main difference being that that core stage now has 4 engines. So yeah, throttle everything up. This thing takes a long time to get those engines going, but once it moves, it has pretty good acceleration off the pad. Only thing is, I do kind of mess up my gravity turn here. I overturn, and I'm very lucky. I'm very careful that I don't lose control of this completely. At one point, I felt it was going to diverge, and I brought that thing back into line before I lost the entire vehicle. But yeah, if you watch the Apple apps during this launch, it does not get particularly high. Yeah, there we go. We have 6 of those Minuteman solid rocket boosters. We have a pair of those proton boosters, and then of course we have a ton of those, well, we have 6 of those hydrogen-fueled rockets. We have a couple on boosters on the side, and we have a single core stage with a ton of fuel. Actually, not literally a ton, that's a metaphorical ton. Lots and lots and lots of tons of fuel. Lots of elephants of fuel. Have you seen that video? Yes. Look, it's a lot of fuel in this thing, and this will take Tatiana to the moon, and she will stay there for 2 weeks. But we'll see that in the next episode. Until then, I'm Scott Manley. Fly safe.